Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to all of you. This annual forum has been an extraordinary event. You know, we've had more than 60 different sessions in the past 3 days. And we've heard from experts and practitioners on a whole range of issues around implementing the guiding principles. So everything from getting human rights deeply into the supply chain of companies to aligning it with the Sustainable Development Goals and to discussions on the possibilities of a binding treaty. Now, since this year's theme is on tracking progress and ensuring coherence, I want to share a quick story with you that illustrates the potential of these two concepts for the future of our field. In 1987, the aluminum company Alcoa appointed a new CEO. At his first shareholder meeting, this new leader, Paul O'Neill, he didn't announce that he was going to restructure the company or sell off some of the more profitable bits. What he said instead was that from now on, he would focus exclusively on making it the safest company in the world. And it was about the least sexy thing he could say for his investors, but he really stuck to it. Almost immediately, O'Neill instituted a policy where all the company executives had to attend the funeral of any worker who was killed on the job. And in the first few weeks of his tenure, a worker was killed in rural Mexico. And O'Neill forced his executives to fly away from whatever meetings they were attending around the world to go and attend that funeral. And he made all the executives, even the ones that were in charge of things like marketing, visit the plant where that worker was killed to find out what went wrong and what could have prevented it. Now suddenly, safety became the concern of everyone in the company. And every accident at every plant was seen as a company-wide failure. Now, 13 years into O'Neill's tenure, the accident rate had fallen to near zero. And many of the safety fixes reported by the workers made them more efficient. So profitability went up by 400% in that time. Now, I'm not telling this story to imply that everything a company does to improve human rights conditions will boost companies' profits. I mean, some of these things will, and some of them won't. And I think we should continue then to stress the moral and the legal cases, as well as the business case for good human rights practices. But what I do think this story illustrates the most is the immense power of companies to measure their performance and to relentlessly improve it. 30 years ago, companies would have said it was impossible to reduce fatalities to almost zero. And before the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, companies said it was impossible to operate in developing countries without paying bribes. And yet, when the incentives changed, either inside the companies or outside of them, the companies changed too. Now, with this in mind, I want to highlight a few areas where the working group sees the greatest potential for the guiding principles to contribute to updating the incentives for business and to changing the cultures within them. With regard to Pillar 1, the state duty to protect human rights, let me outline or highlight just two key actions. First, the working group asks all states to develop national action plans on human rights and business. This is an essential vehicle for ensuring policy coherence and action across the entire government. And it's encouraging that more states are moving in this direction, with more than 24 national action plans now under development. But these plans must be effective tools for creating a sustainable business environment. So not laundry lists of what the state is already doing in this area. They need to include concrete actions and measurable targets for future achievements. And NHRIs and civil society and business, they have a role to play here as well, both in driving the states to take on these processes, as well as in making sure that these processes are comprehensive and robustly implemented. Now, second, we need more policy coherence within governments when they are economic actors themselves. A few months ago, the working group conducted a survey on how states are functioning as economic actors. And the results showed that a lot more work is needed in this area. At a minimum, all state-owned enterprises should have policies and due diligence systems in place to respect human rights. And further, states should include human rights criteria in their own purchasing practices. Public procurement can be around 20% of GDP, and in some states it reaches as high as 50% of GDP. So clearly, it's one of the key vehicles to getting the guiding principles reverberating through entire economies. Now, Pillar 2 on the corporate responsibility to respect human rights is becoming an established norm in the business community. But we need to both widen and deepen this trend. First, we need more dissemination of the guiding principles across the business community. And I do understand how mundane that sounds, to make a call for more dissemination. But there are so many companies out there that haven't heard of the guiding principles, nor who see that human rights has anything to do with business. I mean, I can walk into many companies today, and I will still get the response that, human rights, that's about torture of political dissidents, and that's about press freedoms. That has nothing to do with my company. Now, I think things like this annual forum go a long way towards getting human rights and business on the global radar. And a lot of the excellent work of your organizations out there do the same. But we need to keep that energy up for dissemination, and we need to particularly start targeting like those state-owned enterprises and also the companies that tend to escape from the public pressure and scrutiny for responsible business practice. And we've heard a lot these last 3 days about Pillar 3, access to remedy, which remains one of the most overlooked in terms of existing initiatives in our field. So we need to really ramp up our efforts in this area. Now, first, in relation to judicial remedy, domestic legal systems around the world, the courts lack the capacity to hear these cases. And sometimes when they do, they're subject to political corruption. And sometimes when judgments are reached, they're not enforced. So we need more international cooperation, particularly between home and host states in this area. And the findings and recommendations from OHCHR's Accountability and Remedy Project offer a very good starting point for states in this area. Now, second, in relation to non-judicial mechanisms, we're seeing an increase in business-related complaints handled by national human rights institutions, OECD contact points, and even company grievance mechanisms. And as we've heard at this forum, we're seeing some good experiments with community-based monitoring and joint grievance handling. But all of these efforts are still young and they're still experimental. So we need to disseminate these more widely, as well as we need to start critically assessing them for which ones are best delivering on our goal. So not just on the human rights processes, but on the human rights outcomes. And finally, I want to make one general consideration that all of us, no matter which pillar or which actor we're working upon, should keep in mind. And that is that effectively implementing the guiding principles means measuring and tracking where we're making progress and where we're falling behind. We need comprehensive data on how businesses are impacting human rights and on what states and businesses are doing about those impacts. The CEO of Alcoa didn't make his deputies care about health and safety by asking them to. He provided them with the numbers, and he rewarded them for improving performance, and he punished them for degrading performance. We often hear from business and governments that implementing the guiding principles is difficult, and sometimes it is. But the first step is creating the right incentive structures, and that's where we still have a lot of work ahead of us. So those are the strategic points of traction that the UN Working Group would like to emphasize after 3 very full days of rich discussion with all of you. Now, we'll have the opportunity to explore these further in our Asia Regional Forum, as well as to take these forward into the next annual forum. But, you know, developments are possible across so many different areas, and I'm conscious that I've named just a few. So today we have a very distinguished panel of folks coming from governments and from business and from civil society to share their insights and thoughts about how we can best speed up and scale up the implementation of the guiding principles. So I would like to thank all of our panelists for joining us today and hand back to our distinguished chair to move us on with the discussion.